It's a great pleasure to be here with Martin and with people from the university. I've just been at the Labour Party conference. Next week I go to the Conservative Party conference, and 2 weeks later I go to the Liberal Party conference. So I've obviously done something very wicked in a previous life. But anyway, interestingly, a lot of the debates around both the Labour Party conference and at the Tories next week, and I guess at the Libs in a couple of weeks' time, will be about these issues. So we're very, very fortunate, I guess, in our country right now that we have an economic recovery underway after a period of deep and profound depression. The question, I guess, for us is, are we going to have a social recovery to sit alongside the economic recovery that is underway? I think we're pretty fortunate to live in a country where it really is part of our DNA that everyone should have a fair chance in life. Yet too often, as we know, demography truly is destiny in our country. Being born poor often leads to a lifetime of poverty. Poor schools tend to ease people into poor jobs. Disadvantage and advantage cascade down the generations. The truth about our country is that over decades we have become far wealthier, but in truth we've struggled to become fairer. Tonight I want to explore why that might be the case, and most importantly of all, for someone who is still engaged in public policy, what can actually be done about it? So compared with many other developed nations, we have high levels of child poverty and low levels of social mobility. Only 1 in 8 children from low-income households goes on to achieve a high income as an adult. The association between incomes of fathers and sons, which is a key measure of social mobility, is twice as strong in the UK as in countries such as Finland, Australia or Canada. Very different social models. It is possible for a country to be unequal and socially mobile. Both Australia and Canada actually have high inequality and also relatively high social mobility. But overall, the global evidence suggests a causal relationship between the two. It appears to be harder to climb the ladder when the rungs are further apart. We know that the UK is a highly unequal society. Social division takes many forms. The UK is divided spatially. You can see that. I see it every week when I travel from Newcastle, which is in one country, to London, which is frankly a different one. There are big divides in earnings and education by ethnicity, and there is an enduring, if narrowing, gender divide. 60% of low-paid workers in our country are women. When more than 1 in 6 children, 2.3 million, in our country are officially classified as poor, that exacts a pretty high social price. There's an economic price too, in wasted potential and lower growth. One study found that Western countries with high social mobility have enjoyed a much higher economic growth rate over the past century than low mobility economies. Like Hazel, I have a very personal reason for caring about these issues. I grew up on a council estate and I was fortunate enough to end up in the cabinet. I was very fortunate in my life. I was probably born at the right time. The 1950s and 1960s saw Britain finally emerging from the aftershock of the war years. Social mobility was in full swing. There was, of course, the most appalling poverty and inequality. For many times were hard. This was not in any sense a golden age. But it was a time of great hope. Having won a grueling war in which so many had sacrificed so much, there was a shared determination in our country to win the peace. That determination rather, found expression in the post-war Labour government's towering achievements: full employment, universal education, a new welfare state. Together, they brought new opportunities to millions in our country. By 1958, when I was born, the prospect of a more classless society seemed within reach. Anthony Crosland, amongst others, thought it on the horizon. For Michael Young, it seemed so imminent that he published his book, The Rise of the Meritocracy, in that year, precisely to warn about the downsides of a genuinely meritocratic society. 5 decades on, and such optimism looks hopelessly misplaced. Intractable levels of social inequality and a flatlining in social mobility have thwarted repeated attempts to realise that post-war vision of a good and truly fair society. But every cloud really does have a silver lining. The global financial crisis has brought a new concern to the fore. In its wake, a new public consensus has begun to emerge that unearned wealth for a few at the top, growing insecurity for many in the middle, and stalled life chances for those at the bottom is not really a viable social proposition for Britain. As birth rather than worth has become more and more a determinant of life chances, higher social mobility, reducing the extent to which a person's class or income is dependent on the class or income of their parents, has become the newly holy grail of public policy. That is a development that I regard as most welcome. The job of the Commission on Social Mobility and Child Poverty, which Prime Minister Cameron and Deputy Prime Minister Clegg established, and which I chair, is to assess candidly and independently whether what this and future governments actually do, as distinct from what they say, is helping or hindering the prospect of Britain becoming a more mobile society. Of course, there are many things that determine life chances that are way beyond the reach of government: individual temperament, family life, social attitudes. And there are many questions that other institutions in civil society, employers, schools, universities, to name but three, also have to answer if social progress is to be made. I don't know whether David Cameron is still fond of saying it, but he used to be fond of saying that we're all in this together. And I agree with him, on this at least. And that is why the Commission's focus is also on the policy and practice of all of those institutions that can make such an important contribution to improving and indeed equalising life chances. The test we apply as a Commission is not about good intentions. We take those as read. It's about whether the right actions are being taken. Certainly there is much to welcome in what government, employers, schools, universities are currently doing to address these issues. There is considerable effort and a raft of initiatives underway. The question is whether the scale and depth of activity is enough to combat the headwinds that Britain faces if we are to move forward to becoming a low poverty, high mobility society. The conclusion that my Commission reached in its first annual State of the Nation report last year is that it is currently not. We concluded that the statutory goal of ending child poverty by 2020 will in all likelihood be missed by a considerable margin, perhaps by as many as 2 million children, and with it the end of a decade-long reduction in levels of child poverty. We concluded too that there is a very real danger that social mobility, having risen in the middle of the last century and then flatlined towards the end, could actually go into reverse in the first part of this century. These are profound challenges for all political parties, and not just those currently in government. In the lead up to next year's general election, each of the parties will all have a responsibility to say how they would address these challenges in order to make progress. In our view, the starting point is for policymakers to come to terms with a new truth that has often been lost in the massive data and swirl of debate around these topics. Although entrenched poverty, of course, has to be a priority and does require a specific policy approach, transient poverty, growing insecurity, and stalling mobility are far more widespread than politicians, employers, and educators have so far recognised. Too often, in political debate and in media discourse, these issues are treated as marginal, when in fact they're mainstream. Poverty touches almost half of Britain's citizens at some point over a 9-year period. Over half over a 9-year period. The nature of poverty has fundamentally changed. When I first became a minister in 1997, when Labour came to office, less than half of the kids growing up in poverty lived in a household where one adult worked. Poverty was a function of worklessness. Over the course of the last 20 or so years, something has fundamentally changed. Partially a product actually of good public policy, creating more jobs, getting more lone parents, chiefly women, into work. These were huge steps towards social progress. The consequence today is that child poverty is now overwhelmingly not a problem of the work less, it's a problem of the working poor. 2 in 3 children who are officially classified as poor in our country today are now in households where an adult works. And in 3/4 of those households, one parent at least is working full-time. The principal problem seems to be that those working parents simply do not earn enough money to escape poverty. Recent decades have seen some profound societal shifts driven by economic and labour market change that truly is making the vision of a more fair and mobile society harder to achieve. Now, these changes have impacted those in the middle of society as well as those at the bottom. There is a growing cohort of middle-income families squeezed between falling earnings and rising house prices, rising tuition fees, and rising youth unemployment, who fear for the first time, almost in a century, that their children will be worse off than they have been. The proportion of households headed by someone aged 25 to 34 who own their own home has fallen in just one decade from around 60% to around 40%. In other words, a society where opportunities are frozen rather than fluid hurts more than just those at the very bottom end. It hurts the people President Clinton once famously called the forgotten middle class. They face a glass ceiling in British society. In our recent report that some of you might have read, Elitist Britain, the Commission examined the background of the 4,000 people with the most wealth, power and influence in our country. We found this: 71% of senior judges, 62% of senior military officers, 55% of Whitehall permanent secretaries, 53% of senior diplomats, 50% of members of the House of Lords, 45% of public body chairs, 44% of the Sunday Times Rich List, 43% of newspaper columnists, 36% of the cabinet, and indeed 22% of the shadow cabinet all attended private schools, compared to 7% of the public as a whole. Of course, the best people need to be in the top jobs, and there are very many good people who have been to private school. It is the degree of domination that is the concern. Few people believe that the sum total of talent in Britain resides in just 7% of pupils in our country's schools, or for that matter, less than 1% of students in our Oxbridge universities. The institutions that matter do appear to be a cosy club. The data is so stark, the story is so consistent, that it is hard to avoid the conclusion that Britain is deeply elitist. Sir John Major was right to warn, as he did last year, that in every single sphere of British influence, the upper echelons of power are held overwhelmingly by a small elite. In a democratic society, institutions, from the law to the media, derive their legitimacy in part by how inclusive they are. Where institutions rely on too narrow a range of people, from too narrow a range of backgrounds, with too narrow a range of experiences, they risk behaving in ways and focusing on issues that are of salience to a minority, but not to the majority in society. The flip side is that the more a few dominate our country's leading institutions, the less likely it is that the many believe they can make a valuable contribution. A closed shop at the top can all too easily give rise to a not-for-the-likes-of-me syndrome in the rest of society. Overcoming declining levels of public engagement and trust in our country's institutions, and not just in our country's politics, relies on them more consciously opening their doors to a wider pool of talent. Social mobility relies on people across the income spectrum being able to move up and get on. If we truly want to be a Britain where it is not background or birth, but aptitude and ability that determines life chances, I believe we have to confront the twin problem that sits at the heart of our society. Middle-class aspirations and working-class opportunities to advance are both, in truth, being thwarted. A twin solution is therefore needed. We need to break open the closed shop at the top of British society and we also need to expand the middle. In my view, it should be our country's explicit ambition to create a bigger middle class with more avenues for advancement. A growing middle class is the foundation for a more mobile country. Now, the public policy implications that flow from this analysis, I believe, are profound. It means being far more intentional about creating targeted interventions for those who live in endemic poverty, including income transfers and financial incentives to help them get a foot onto the first rung of the social ladder. It also means opening up more opportunities for those who are on the ladder but still encounter barriers that prevent them from moving up. These are distinct, although of course related approaches. I've heard it sometimes suggested that public policy has to choose between an economic-led or an opportunity-led agenda to social justice. The truth is, both are needed. The trick is to avoid confusion between them. When that happens, the result is not only poor public policy, it also gives rise to poor politics, with the needs of lower income families seemingly in conflict with the needs of middle class ones. Beating child poverty, unleashing social mobility relies on a broad coalition of public support to be built. It relies too on a unifying view of what sort of society and what type of fairness we want to create. Historically, in our country at least, there have been broadly two schools of thought. One is that we should be aiming for a flatter society with greater equality of outcome. The objection to that approach is that it needs to be imposed by a central state authority with outcomes divorced from citizens' work or effort or contribution. The other is that we should aim for a greater equality of opportunity. The problem with that is, in the words of Tony, that the invitation for all to come to dinner takes place in the sure knowledge that circumstances would prevent most people from attending. Today's world is, of course, a very different world from that of R.H. Tawney. A globalized capitalist economy, more welfare state social democracy have successfully combined to eradicate the worst excesses of social inequality which first gave birth to progressive politics. Thankfully, laws protect workers. They uphold gender and racial equality. It is not that disadvantage has been eradicated, it hasn't, but it does take a different form. As Amartya Sen has noted, families and communities suffer not only economic disadvantage, but social, educational, and cultural disadvantage too. That suggests to me that a more holistic agenda is needed. In my view, its focus needs to be on how we narrow the gap in life chances between the less well-off and the better off, so that those who have the aptitude and aspiration to do so get a fair opportunity to progress, regardless of their starting point in life. Such an approach recognizes that people should have a fair chance at every stage and every age of life, not a one-off opportunity, whether aged 11 or at 16. It recognizes too that social mobility isn't something that can be given to people. It has to be won through their efforts and their endeavors. Governments and others, of course, can do more to equalize opportunities throughout life, but in the end, social mobility relies on individual drive and individual ambition. The critical question we should be asking as a nation is whether the gap between the most well-off and the least well-off is narrowing or widening when it comes to getting those life chances. Now, better definition. Increasing social mobility is not easy. It requires a long-term effort. Some say it is an impossible task. Personally, I do not succumb to that pessimism. My commission has seen enough evidence from around the world and in our country's own history to know that with the right approach, it is possible to break the transmission of disadvantage from one generation to the next. Of course, there is no single lever that on its own can make Britain a more socially mobile society. No single organisation can make it happen either. All sorts of things make a difference. Family networks, parenting styles, career services, school standards, Career development opportunities, university admission procedures, all of these are stepping stones towards a more equal and fair society. But the global evidence suggests there are 5 big levers that really unlock social progress. They open the door to a society with lower levels of child poverty, higher levels of social mobility, and a growing middle class. First, early years education. The UK as a whole significantly underinvests in childcare. Public spending on childcare in the UK is around 0.4% of our GDP. That is about half the level of Sweden or Norway. The OECD evidence shows that child poverty is lowest and social mobility is highest where parents can rely on universal, quality and critically affordable childcare and early learning services. Early education packs a double punch. It positively affects children's ability and it enables more parents to work. Having all parents in a household in employment massively reduces the chances of a family being in poverty. Widely available, affordable childcare is the best means of securing income for a family since it dramatically lifts the maternal employment rate. This is the conclusive evidence, by the way, from the experience not just of the Nordic countries but of Canadian provinces like Quebec, which have introduced universal pre-school childcare. In Scandinavia, to remind you, child poverty rates are less than 2/3 of British rates. Despite help with costs through the tax credit system and the introduction of free childcare places over the past decade, 42% of British women who work part-time say they do so because of their caring responsibilities. It is the highest figure in the developed world. Household income suffers and in-work poverty grows as a result. Across Britain, all 3- and 4-year-olds now have access to some free early education provision. In England, that is being gradually extended to the 40% most disadvantaged 2-year-olds. But we're a long way from childcare being affordable or universal or high enough quality. We're even further from politicians being willing to break the last great taboo of public policy. Governments stepping in to help parents to parent. In the end, the biggest influence on a child's life chances is not a school or a university. It isn't a Sure Start Centre. It is still less a government. It is your parents. What parents do massively impacts what you do in life. 2 in 5 of children from the poorest homes are read to every day. In the wealthiest homes, it's 4 in 5. We should have the courage in public policy to say what is good parenting and what is bad. And most importantly, we should be prepared to do something about it. More support, in my view, is needed to bridge that parenting gap because it is so crucial to closing the life chances gap. Secondly, closing another gap, the one in attainment between better off and less well-off children in schools. You know, for a long time, it was widely accepted by governments and public alike that when it came to learning, deprivation really was destiny. Better off kids would naturally excel, poor kids would naturally fall behind. We now have extensive evidence, international and domestic, that such social determinism is plain wrong. Countries as different as Canada, Poland, Singapore have demonstrated a great track record in raising the attainment level of all of their poorest children. There is a long way to go in our own country. Only 38% of children on free school meals here, roughly the poorest sixth in society, get good exam results at age 16, compared to 65% of other children. This, by the way, is not innate. Low ability children from wealthy families overtake high ability children from poor families during primary school. Perhaps unsurprisingly, children in the most deprived parts of the country are still 20% less likely to attend a good secondary school than those in the least deprived. Nonetheless, over the last 15 years, something remarkable has happened. Educational inequality hasn't widened, it's narrowed. Children who receive free school meals have had faster improving results at age 16 than those who do not. Progress has been most startling in London, where pupils who are entitled to free school meals now have attainment at the age of 16, which is 50% higher than free school meal students in the northwest of England, or indeed in any other region of our country. The last decade has seen a startling change in the geography of educational inequality. London used to have amongst the worst state schools in the country. Today, they are the best. That didn't happen by chance. A decade of effort to raise standards and recruit good teachers has paid off. All of that suggests that raising standards and closing attainment gaps should be the twin objectives for all teachers and all schools. Critically, since the global evidence suggests that it is the quality of teaching that is the key factor in helping close attainment gaps, the best teachers, in our view as a Commission, should have better incentives, including higher pay, to teach in the worst schools. With the right teaching, with the right resources and the right support, the link between deprivation and destiny can be broken. As our economy becomes ever more reliant on high levels of skill and education, they will become more critical to social mobility in the future. Study after study has come to the self-same conclusion. Time spent productively in education, including the vital early years, is the most important determinant of future social status. That is why the top social and economic priority for our country, for whichever party is in government after 2015, should remain in 3 words: education, education, education. Third, fair access to higher education and vocational training. In the most mobile societies, students are helped to make the transition to employment via higher education for the most academically able and via vocational education for those wanting to develop their technical skills. In Britain, by contrast, we have a twin problem: unequal access to higher education and a very low priority accorded to vocational. So today, the most advantaged 20% of young people are still over 6 times more likely to attend the most selective universities as the 40% most disadvantaged. There is a strong correlation between social class and the likelihood of going to university generally and to the top universities in particular. It cannot be right that each year 4 private schools and 1 college send more kids to Oxbridge than 2,000 state schools put together. So those universities, particularly the elite universities, will need to redouble their efforts to ensure they are genuinely open to all those with talent and potential. Who gets into university and how they get on once they have left will, as our economy becomes ever more knowledge-based, become more important in determining whether Britain's sluggish rates of social mobility can be improved. That is why, in our view, the government should act urgently to address the dramatic decline in applications from part-time and mature students in the wake of the increase in tuition fees. Universities also need to do more, not least in making regular use of contextual data, such as the standards of the school attended by the applicant and not just their attainment at age 18. That needs to become the norm, not the exception, in determining who to admit. Here at Salford, I know the university is wholeheartedly committed to the widening participation agenda. 43% of young entrants to this university are from working class backgrounds. 22% come from disadvantaged areas. Around 10% were eligible for free school meals when they sat their GCSEs. So there is much to commend at this university in particular. Of course, university won't be right for every young person. Public policy has for decades focused on university education, not the other 50% who go on to take vocational education or work. They face lower funding and greater complexity in their choices. Whereas countries like Germany and Australia accord high status to vocational education and apprenticeships as a route into employment, the UK has tended to place its bets on higher rather than further education. Germany, for example, has 4 times as many apprentices relative to its workforce as the United Kingdom. Further education is far less generously funded in our country than higher education. It has also been subject to large reductions in funding. Many FE colleges do a sterling job of work, but it is worth remembering that today more than 1 million learners are in provision that is rated less than good, which is why we want to see colleges paid in future according to the outcomes that students achieve rather than simply the numbers that they recruit. Fourthly, putting in place the right incentives to work. Rightly, for decades, the focus on public policy has been on moving people off welfare and into work. And when we still have 2 million people who are unemployed and very high levels of youth unemployment, that of course requires renewed effort. A job remains the best safeguard against being poor. But we also know it's not a cure for poverty. Since the 1970s, technological change in our country has been skills biased. In other words, people with higher levels of skill have seen large increases both in their productivity and in their pay, while those with low skills have experienced reduced demand for labour and lower average earnings. Today, we have a segregated, one could argue, a 2-tier labour market in our country. Those with skills and qualifications tend to enjoy greater job security, higher levels of prosperity, and better prospects of social advance. Those without skills find it hard to escape a world of constant insecurity, endemic low pay, and frankly little prospect of social progress. There are over 300,000 workers in our country, mainly women, who've been stuck at minimum wages of pay for the last 5 years. Over 200,000 have been stuck there for over 10 years. Over recent decades, increases in 0-hour and short-term contracts and self-employment, the decline of collective bargaining and yes, of strong trade unions, the collapse of internal career ladders, in part a consequence of increased outsourcing and specialisation within firms, and the replacement of jobs with technology have all impacted opportunities for low-paid workers to progress. The problem has been decades in the making. The share of national income going to workers in the bottom half of the income distribution fell by 1/4 between 1979 and 2009. Even at the height of the boom, during the Labour years in the 2000s, the truth is earnings were stagnating. In fact, government-funded tax credits were the only substantial source of real income growth for low to middle income households between 2003 and 2008. Since then, average weekly earnings have fallen in real terms. They're actually lower today than they've been for over a decade. More and more people fall into a poverty trap as a result, even if they do all the right things and they go out to work. It is welcome, in my view, that the cost of living issue is now high on the political agenda. The problem is that the answers the political parties are searching for across the spectrum, whether caps on energy bills or more competition in the energy market, can at best provide only short-term respite. What is lacking across all of the parties is a long-term answer about how we bridge the gap between earnings stagnating and prices rising. It is worth remembering that with inflation and interest rates across the developed world now at record lows, the cost of living crisis is as much a problem of stagnating earnings as it is of rising prices. Without corrective action, the risk is this, that the UK's economic recovery, though welcome, merely perpetuates a decade-long decline in real earnings. The changes we're seeing in the labour market and the experiences of the last decade suggest that the old assumption, which has underpinned so much of our public policy, of a tide of economic growth causing all boats to rise, may no longer hold. Economic growth has become decoupled from earnings growth. It started in the United States of America. For 25 years, middle-class households have not seen their incomes rise in real terms. And then it spread to the UK. And then it is in Germany and in France. And yes, even in social democratic Scandinavia. That has profound consequences for our prospect of Britain becoming more mobile and more fair. A recovery that sees national wealth rise is, of course, an economic success. But if earnings fall or fall behind, that is a social failure. So just as the UK government has focused on reducing the country's financial deficit, it now needs to redouble its efforts to reduce our country's fairness deficit. All parts of society have had to shoulder the pain of fiscal consolidation. In turn, all parts of society should share fairly in the proceeds of renewed economic growth. In my view, it should be a new and explicit objective of public policy to reforge the link that has been broken between economic growth, average earnings, and social fairness. That will require new thinking, and it will require new approaches. The old ways of doing things will not do the trick. Today, the United Kingdom has one of the highest rates of low pay in the developed world. 5 million workers, again, mainly women, earn less than the living wage. Outside of London, that is £7.65 per hour. It is hardly a king's ransom. By the way, these are the people that heed the urgings of David Cameron, Nick Clegg, Ed Miliband, to do all the right things, to stand on their own 2 feet, to strive, not shirk, to look after their families, accept their responsibilities, but they simply do not earn enough to escape poverty. The working poor, in my view, are truly the forgotten people of Britain, and they desperately need a new deal. The national minimum wage is worth £1,000 less today in real terms per year than it was in 2008. It should be increased. Work programme providers and Job Centre Plus should be rewarded for the earnings that people they help receive, not just the jobs that they get. And employers should look to provide better pay and better career prospects based on improving skills and training for their workforces. Of course, there is a debate to be had about how higher earnings and higher employment can coexist. That will be for employers and trade unions and governments to hammer out. But I do not believe that poverty can be beaten or mobility improved without doing more to tackle low pay in our country and closing the gap between earnings and prices. Finally, the chance to get a career in the professions. We know from our history that the chances of social mobility are greater if there are more professional jobs in our economy. The upsurge in professional employment in the middle of the last decade, in the middle of the last century, created an unparalleled wave of social mobility. It created unprecedented opportunities for millions of women and men to step up and get on. The advent of a white-collar labour market instead of a blue-collar one created what the academics call more room at the top, more room for people like me and Hazel. Today, 45% of all employment in the UK is in the professions. That will rise to around 50% within the next 10 years. The professions will account for over half of all new jobs in Britain in the next decade. The question is whether the growth in professional employment is creating a new social mobility dividend for our country. The short answer is that it is not. Evidence suggests the professions are actually, if anything, becoming more and not less socially exclusive over time. At the top especially, they remain dominated by a social elite. Sadly, it's not much better at the bottom. The latest available data, for example, suggests that of entrants to the senior civil service fast stream, only 25 of 600 entrants came from working class backgrounds. 1/3 of today's trainee doctors are privately educated. It's about the same for our trainee lawyers. The consequence is that too many able children from average income and middle class families, let alone those at the very bottom end of society, are losing out in the race for professional jobs. Take internships. In my time, they have become a new rung on the career ladder into a professional job. But they tend to go not on the basis of what you know, but of who you know. In professions from medicine to journalism, most interns are still recruited informally, so favouring those in the know and those with connections. Most internships are also unpaid, so disadvantaging those from less affluent backgrounds who cannot afford to work for free for any length of time. That is why we believe it is time for the professions to end the practice of unpaid internships. And it is time for our country's top professional employers to change their recruitment practices by looking for talent not in a dozen universities, as they do today, but in the 120 universities that we're fortunate as a country to have. Now, I believe that these 5 levers, based on the evidence that I've seen from across the world, can make a profound difference to reducing poverty and speeding mobility. I recognise that the analysis that I provide is challenging, and more so the proposals that my commission makes for change. They're a challenge, by the way, not just to national government or to local government. They're a challenge to employers and professions, to local communities, to parents, and to schools and to universities. A far bigger national effort will be needed if progress is to be made on reducing poverty and improving mobility. That will require leadership at every level. Government, particularly in a time of fiscal restraint, simply cannot do it alone. Despite the tough climate for doing so, I believe that progress can and must be made. I know from evidence that I've seen, both from other countries and our own, that demography need not be destiny. The progress made in London schools over recent years is one such proof point. Fewer children living in poverty over the last decade is another. But if Britain is to avoid being a country where all too often birth does determine fate, we have to do far more to create more of a level playing field of opportunity. That, in my view, has to become core business for our nation, and it has to become core business for whoever forms the next government of our country. Thank you very much.